Welcome to another edition of News in Depth. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. Now, major US-India trade deals promises reduced tariffs in exchange for cutting Russian oil imports. But will India really walk away from cheap crude? Then Elon Musk's $1.25 trillion SpaceX XAI merger reshaped tech and space. Joining us today on DVP World to unpack these stories is Kuba Kapiszewski, business editor of DVP World. Hello and welcome to News in Depth.
Very happy to be here, Ben.
All right, so before we kick things off, we do have a statement by Magdalena Pacek, energy and commodity analyst at Unimont, to give us a little bit of look into the incentives of purchasing Russian oil. So let's take a look.
If you are the third largest oil consumer in the world and 90% of your refinery crude intake comes from abroad, then the price is crucial for you. And Russian grades are offered with huge discounts.
And huge discounts indeed. So the latest deal sees U.S. cut tariffs and claim that India will end Russian oil purchases, but Modi's and others say India won't immediately stop. How real is this end Russian oil part of the agreement?
Well, I think history gives us a hint in this regard, because when you actually look at the history of Indian oil imports, and as the very nice energy analyst pointed out a minute before, India is relying on oil imports very much because it doesn't produce a lot of the fuel domestically. So historically, Russia hasn't been a big provider of oil to India. Indians started buying massive amounts of Russian oil in 2022. So before that, only 3% of Indian oil purchases came from Russia, but nowadays it's closer to 35%. So they went from virtually zero to 1/3 of their supply relying on Russia. So this change shows us that they are capable of switching providers of oil pretty fast. So in other words, it should be theoretically possible for them to just end reliance on Russian oil and switch to other suppliers, just as they switched from other suppliers to Russia after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
All right, that's like a very good point, actually. The fact that they can go from 30% to like roughly 35% kind of in a drop of a dime probably also means that if they want to find someone else, the possibility is on the table as well. And that is also something that the U.S. president is trying to hint at as well, talking about Venezuelan oil. We do have the statement here as well. Let's take a look. Oh, right, in this case, does seem like we don't have it at the moment, but yeah, Donald Trump has mentioned using Venezuelan oil as an alternative. Given India's history of, well, now sourcing a third of their oil from Russia at a steep discount, how economically sensible is it for New Delhi to pivot to United States or Venezuelan?
Well, historically, both the US and Venezuela were providers of oil to India. They just weren't selling so much. But actually, put yourself in boots of a government in New Delhi. It's in your interest to have as many providers as possible, because then you just diversify the risk. If any one of those producers has some production problems and you're being cut out of supply from this particular country, then you just switch automatically to others, right? So diversification is good for your oil supply. And Venezuela historically has been providing India with oil, and so did the United States. So for India, it would be just going back in time a little bit, as is with the case of Russian oil. So it is technically feasible because the transportation costs aren't as big. Venezuela's oil is cheap to produce. It's not as cheap as Russian oil, but it's quite cheap. So even if you add this transportation cost, it's still a very good deal for India. So I think, Trump is trying to kill two birds with one stone. So in other words, okay, I gained control. I'm using quotation marks because Americans don't own the Venezuelan oil industry. Not yet. Not yet. But for him to provide a new market for Venezuelan oil would make this transition, because it's in very bad shape. It has been mismanaged massively during the Maduro administration. So it needs investment. Ideally, this investment should come from business deals that the Venezuelan industry does, not from banking sector or US investors. So in this sense, Trump is trying to kill two birds with one stone, because he gives Venezuelan oil industry a chance to have a very smooth transition into the global market. Listen, there is a big purchaser, very keen on your oil, send them a lot of this stuff, earn some cash, upgrade your facilities, and you won't have to introduce American capital to do it. So, well, the puzzles are here. Right. It kind of fits. The question is whether he can make this deal go through.
All right, speaking of killing two birds with one stone and various factors to consider, looking at this deal, well, Trump has been talking about putting secondary sanctions on Russia and asking India to stay away from Russian oil. Do you think that this deal we're looking at is a U.S. strategic attempt to pry India away from Russian influence, or is this more simply a commercial diplomacy?
Well, it's both. Trump has already punished India with tariffs because Indians have been buying a lot of Russian oil, right? So this was in August last year. So these tariffs that he's bringing down from 50% to 18%, this is actually him removing the punitive tariffs he has put on India because of the Indian state buying Russian oil. I'm not sure whether it's actually possible to pry away India completely from Russia. Europe has been trying to do it without much success. So 2 weeks ago, New Delhi and Brussels announced a big trade deal, the mother of all deals, as it was named even. And after they signed the deal, Indians did some military maneuvers with Russia. So it's just like it's a central policy paradigm in New Delhi to just try to keep your safe distance between all those major powers around the world, not overcommitting to any one of them, being able to do deals with all of them. And it actually pays dividends, as the energy analyst at the beginning of our show said. They were able to buy Russian oil at a significant discount. And you just keep this discount in your pocket, right? Once you process the oil and once you sell it as a gasoline, you can keep the price of gasoline at the same level, but the price of input, oil in this case, was lower, and you just pocket the difference. So it's just good business. It was too good business to say no to.
Right. A lot of times, pragmatic reasons kind of shines through when it comes to business dealings. Oh, there's actually a lot to unpack here as well. You just mentioned earlier that 2 weeks ago, Europe and India signed this mother of all deals, and then the United States coming in and signed a deal with India as well. Do you think that there are some sort of competing interest here?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Trump has been touting America first policy, and Europe's response was, well, we should take care of our own business, but we should also promote this old world construction when we try to make as many trade deals because we still believe in the openness of trade and so on and so on. So Brussels was very keen to actually score some points on this front. Mercosur deal was one example. The India trade deal, which was also 20 years in the making. Can you believe that 20 years of meetings, low-level meetings, all leading to this one big signature at the very end of the process.
It's almost like a whole generation. Imagine
whole generation,
whole career lifetime is just going there and talking.
So Europe was very keen to score some points on the trade front and to show people that actually you can still do international policy by cooperating with people, not by forcing them to do something because you have some demands, because you want Greenland, right, or whatever. So there is this competing vision of doing foreign policy. One which Brussels still stands for is cooperation, and the other one, American, is, well, also cooperation, but a very particular way of cooperating,
right.
by forcing them to do
a little
something.
bit more strong-armed,
yeah, a little
bit
strong-armed,
more kind of play with the cards that they have. And speaking of cards, because looking at EU's dealing with India compared to that of the United States, there seems to be a lacking of talking about Russian oil when it comes to EU's dealing with India as opposed to the United States. So you think that also showcases perhaps the Washington administration actually do have a little bit more cards on the table going into this negotiation compared to the EU, even though EU technically has a bigger market within India? Yeah,
absolutely. That's very strange that Europe announced a big trade deal with India, and there were no strings attached. There was no talk about, hey guys, maybe you should stop doing this business with Russia. It just makes us a little bit nervous and it fuels the war in Ukraine. There was zero talk about that. It was all just roses and flowers and butterflies and whatever. Great deal, excellent deal. And this guy comes He's on the other side of the world, and he can still push Indians towards reaching some other goals, which are not tied completely to the American interest. This shows you that the US president still has this unique position. Some say that the US president's desk is called the bully pulpit. He can just bully people into doing stuff just by the very fact that he sits behind his own desk. And it's still true. Well, it's bad news for Brussels, unfortunately.
And last but not least, staying on this topic, do you think that this deal is going to have a significant impact when it comes to Russia's revenue and ability to generate wealth for its war coffer?
And that's a very good question. And unfortunately, I think that even if Russians don't manage to sell so much oil to India as they did in the past, this oil will still find customers because it's still discounted. This discount rounds at around $15 per barrel. So if a barrel costs $60 on the global market, that's 1/4 of the price. There you go, right? And you can pocket the difference.
Right.
That's why some governments are still very keen on using Russian
with that much
energy.
money laying on the table.
And I'm not talking about only India. You have the same situation here in Europe with Hungary and Slovakia. Still very keen on using Russian oil. So it's just going to go towards other customers who will be very keen on pocketing this difference. And it's very, very important, I think so, to remind people that actually getting rid of all oil, of all Russian oil on the global market was never actually a achievable goal. When the war started, the world was still suffering from the effects of post-pandemic inflation, and politicians around the world were scared that if we take a massive Russian supply, because Russians pump around 8 to 9 million barrels a day, so this puts them in top 5 producers. Very, very, very important. If you take this supply totally off the market, you risk market volatility, you risk oil prices going up. We don't know how much, but maybe significantly. And if oil goes up, prices of everything else also go up.
Right. If you think things are expensive after the pandemic, just wait until that happens.
Exactly. So everyone was trying to just subdue the amount of cash that is flowing through Moscow via their energy sales, but not by taking the supply totally off the market.
Right.
And we've been successful to an extent, well, by we, I mean the Western world, was successful to an extent because the energy revenue that Moscow receives actually halved when compared to the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So that's a significant amount of money, but they are still earning a significant amount of money by exporting all its energy stuff.
Well, so we'll have to see how this deal goes. But in the meantime, I'd like to move on to our next topic as well, because recently we saw the SpaceX and XAI merger, and very curious about Musk's strategy. How do you read this of $1.25 trillion for the combined SpaceX XAI entity? The strategic genius or some sort of financial engineering?
I think it's a little bit of both, because clearly there is a big puzzle, and Elon Musk is trying to fit all the elements together, and they kind of fit. Because basically what this transaction tells us is some people are willing to take the AI bubble to the next level. So Musk says that we don't have enough resources here on Earth to build all the data centers that are needed to power the AI revolution. And we've seen the biggest players in the field, Microsoft's, Google's, Alphabet's, and the sorts of companies, complaining that the energy grids are unable to provide all the energy that is needed to power those data centers. So Elon Musk's response to this dilemma is, let's just build this all data center stuff in space. That's his answer, basically, because there you have unlimited access to the solar power. Yeah, exactly. And he's the owner of the dominant player in the space launch industry. So by combining those two, you have the technology to send stuff into space, and you have the technology to build stuff that operates in space, because SpaceX also does satellites, right, on a daily basis. And then you have a company that does AI, and it kind of fits. It kind of fits. But on the other hand, I think it's a long shot, and a very, very long shot, maybe even a moonshot, because at the same time, this guy, well, he always overpromises and kind of underdelivers. That was historically his thing. So he already filed paperwork at the Federal Trade Commission. So this is like a Federal Communications Commission, sorry. So this is a body that allows you to send satellites into space in the United States. And he says that he wants to send 1 million satellites into space, these data center satellites, while at the time SpaceX operates 10,000. So this is like 2 or 3 orders of magnitude more. No one has ever done anything like this, and not on the time scale he proposes, which is 2 or 3 years.
I see. This is the thing that sometimes perplexes me about Musk. Like you mentioned, there is some strategic thinking there, and it's probably a stroke of genius. But at the same time, we also see one of his recent statement here, and I quote, "This marks not just the next chapter, but the next book in SpaceX and XAI's mission, scaling to make a sentient sun to understand the universe and extend the light of consciousness to the star." Now, the question I have written here is, what is he smoking and where can I get some of that? But an off chance that it's actually a stroke of genius. Is there any sort of validity to that, or is it another just case of overpromising, or perhaps a pipe dream of some sorts?
Well, you have to separate the long-term vision from the business case itself, right? Well, this guy has been riding on a promise that his vision actually makes business. It has business sense. So it's not only just a rich guy sending some rockets into space, but this is actually a rich guy sending rockets into space and making money on it, right? This was his basic promise, that once he gets the price of the space transportation so low, those services will be so achievable, so everyone will be able to afford them. Every government, every institution, and so on. So sending stuff into space will be cheap. A lot of stuff can be sent into space. If the space access is cheap, then you can think about settlements on Mars, settlements on Moon, or data centers in the orbit. But the question is the technology actually ready to send all this stuff very, very cheaply now? And I think it's just not ready. There's no business case over there. You have 1.25 trillion valuation. Compare that to the cash that SpaceX is actually earning, which is $60 billion per year. And you see there is 1,000 times difference between the valuation of the company and what it actually earns. So that's unprecedented in the history of financial markets, that you have so big difference between how the company values itself, or how is it valued by the market, and how much cash it actually brings in. So the question is, when investors are going to stop believing Elon Musk's promises? Because he just pushes the boundaries, right? We've seen this with Tesla. Oh, we are not making cars anymore. Let's do humanoid robots, right? And there are no robots that entered the market. There is no marketable product, so to speak.
I was upset about that.
So this guy has a history of overpromising and under-delivering, and I think he keeps pushing his promises further and further and further, losing touch with the business reality of what he does.
All right, so well, we'll have to see how this goes, but in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight and helping us wrap this up as well. Appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on News in Depth.
Thank you, Ben.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of News in Depth. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.